Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Reset Podcast. I am your host, Lauren Munoz, CEO of the experience agency D-Flash. Each week, I bring on a different leader who's doing cool things and game-changing work. And this is a series of special episodes with Podcast Row and the Glow Podcast Network. And I am super excited to have Dr. Rosenna Bakari, who's an author, scholar, poet, and a genuine amazing woman. And we're going to have a great conversation about how she's built her incredible career and helping victims of abuse be able to find their voice. It's going to be a great conversation. Take a listen. Hello, Rosenna. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm really grateful to be here.
I'm super excited about our conversation. I think it's going to be a great one. As I was saying to you before, I always ask the same question, and I'm always fascinated by the responses that people give. And I'm sure yours will be no different. So, Rosenna, what was your first job?
My first job out of college was an addictions counselor. I earned my master's degree at the age of 22.
Because, of course.
Not really clear about what I wanted to do. And this is back in the 80s, believe it or not. And so my first job was as an addictions counselor, so in drug and alcohol rehab center. And that was a really tough job for a 22-year-old who had so much optimism about the world. Right. And when you're going through counseling programs, like they make you believe that you can actually help and change people and the world is going to be a better place because
you're in it and doing the good stuff.
That's right.
And you're like, nope, hashtag no.
So that was my first job. I burnt out in an average of its average is 3 years. That's how long I lasted in the field, 3 years. And it's like, there's got to be something more hopeful than this.
Yeah, a little touch, a ray of sunshine.
Yes.
All right, so you have the counseling job. You did it for 3 years. You're like, I am not doing that anymore. What leads you to your career today?
So I tried a few things. Eventually, I left the field of psychology and I tried sales, completely flopped at that. And then eventually ended up back in the field of counseling at a university, at the State University of New York at Oswego. At Oswego. And that's where I met my husband. And I loved that job. It was a wonderful job because I was in upstate New York. I was counseling students who, some days their biggest problem was that they had a little tiff with their roommate, and that was so much better.
They may have wanted to murder their roommate.
Right. That was so much better. And I felt so much more fulfilled helping people figure out their lives and what they wanted to do, and it wasn't so serious. So I did that for a little bit, and it didn't take long before my own trauma hit. So it didn't take long. It started out nice and fluffy. Before I knew it, I had not one, not two, but 3 clients who were dealing with childhood sexual abuse. Remember, this is back in the 80s. The word really hasn't existed. We haven't even coined the term yet. Yeah. So at the same time, I had 3 clients that were dealing with issues. And the only thing I really had to relate to them was my own experience, which of course I couldn't reveal to them, but I was trying to process that with them, which of course threw me into my own experience of trauma. And so that began the first part of my journey of where I am today in dealing with this. So.
Wow. So it's as you were counseling those students, you're like, oh, wait a minute.
Right.
Oh, boy. And now you have this amazing practice where we were talking about this yesterday. You've been able to help survivors find the words.
Yes.
And how did you get to be able to do that? Because I know I can't even begin to imagine what that's like. But I just would love to hear how that came to be.
Thank you. Yes. So in the late 80s, when I was counseling and ended up in therapy myself, again, this is the late 80s now. There's still not a lot of information. There's not the World Wide Web. You could look up somebody's address. That's about it, right? So there's just not a ton of information. So I went into therapy. And I did therapy for a little while just to get myself back together, just to pull it back together and be the sunshine of the world that I was supposed to be. And so I didn't stay in therapy long. My husband went with me. He was we were then dating. He went with me, and as I talk about in my book, the worst thing happened to me, and that was that my husband said, because I wanted to break up with him. We were dating, and I'm like, I can't do this right now. This doesn't even make any sense. Like, I'm totally not together. And he said to me, I don't care about what your issues are, what your past is, what kind of healing needs to be done. I love you, and I want you in my life. That was for the healing journey. That's the worst thing.
Really?
It's the worst thing ever. I said, so I packed up all my wounds, I put them back together, and I soaked in this love that this human being had for me, right? And I never talked about it again.
Wow, really?
So, right. So it's like, wow, someone loves me. Like, I just have to get myself together.
And suppress this trauma.
Right. So
Now I get why it's the word. You're like, oh, like this is not how they deal with it.
Right. So I did that. So I went back in my little closet and pulled myself together. And so 14 years later, having never talked about it again, the trauma hit. And this time it was unavoidable. So now there's internet, there's information that I have access to. The world has changed significantly. So this time when I find myself on the floor, balled up in fetal position in a post-traumatic stress trigger from having the violator have been invited into my home by my sister, who was married to him and knew of the trauma. So this is the kind of stuff I had been suppressing for years. Like, I had really tidied, because nobody's talking about this. Nobody's addressing this.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a nice, neat, and tidy way you live about this. Even things we don't talk about.
Right.
Especially in families, especially the families of color. It's like, this doesn't happen.
Right. And I had tidied it up and put a nice, beautiful bow on it with degrees and relationships and fitness and all this stuff. And had structured my life just so that I would not have to deal with this trauma. I just needed one thing to happen. I just needed space. That's it. Like, that was the only little thing I asked for. I just needed space, a teeny bit of space in the world where I could continue to manipulate my own lie. And I couldn't have that.
I just want one thing.
Right. I couldn't have that. So when I found out, because she was coming to visit, because, I'm dealing with trauma. I don't want to live at home. I'm never home. So you construct a life like that. Yes. Right? And you think it's okay.
Yeah.
You don't even realize the lies you live in at some point. And so when I realized she had invited him to come visit with her, like something in me broke. Like, it just broke. I felt like, oh my God, I've been living my entire life just trying to make people happy and make it okay and be a good sister, a good mother, a good, and there was so little space in the world for me. So as I'm balled up in this fetal position on the floor, really experiencing PTSD, the voice said to me, like, you have to live openly. And this aha moment that if you have done so much to convince the world that nothing is wrong with you, that you are so perfect, congratulations, this is your reward. No one has to acknowledge it if you don't acknowledge it. If you don't create enough space in your world to acknowledge your own pain, your own challenges, your own struggle, why would anyone else acknowledge it? Why would anyone give you what you're not giving yourself?
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's kind of like what I was saying yesterday. If you don't talk about what you do and how awesome and amazing you are,
right,
and say it with conviction and fervor, no one's going to believe you. It's the same thing. If you don't speak up and acknowledge your trauma and get the help that you need, then nobody else is going to know how to help you.
Right. So that was it. So when I got out of that, my only way out of that was to live openly. And so when I got myself together, and I remember crawling back in the bed, because my husband couldn't get in the bathroom. He didn't know what was wrong with me, blah, 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 because we haven't talked about this in 14 years.
Yeah. So it's like,
right.
Yeah.
So,
It's like, what's going on here?
Right. And so when I got back into bed, I just said to him, I said, like, I can't live like this anymore. And he's like, live like what? Like, is the house too small? Like what? And so I just said, like, I have to live openly. So that began the conversation and the process for me. So what I found when I woke up the next day with this conviction that I was no longer going to carry this lie, then it became a process. Well, then what does life look like? And figuring that out for myself. And so if you're going to begin to live openly, I was like, oh, well, I don't have language for this. I don't have words for this. Like, how do you have language for something that you swore off ever talking about? So I never even considered literally putting together a sentence that would describe what those experiences were or what they meant for me. So that began the process. So I went into a lot of research and looking and found out that not only did I have problems and difficulty with the language, but that at that time there were 40 million adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Like, so wait a minute, there's 40 of us silenced, 40 million of us silenced? Oh my goodness, how do you silence 40 million people? And so that just angered me. And then
I will fix this.
right. So I dug deeper into the research and really found out that a lot of adult survivors were struggling with addiction. A lot had gone to prison. A lot there's a strong correlation between physical violence, domestic violence, and childhood sexual abuse. And so that just did not sit well with me at all, like as a psychologist or as a researcher or as a survivor myself. And so there was just several iterations of what this experience was going to mean for me. And so I just started writing. At the time, I've always loved writing, and I was already a poet, but I had never written about this, right? And so I started finding ways to use my voice to create words and realized that other survivors needed words as well. So even the term living openly, that's a term that I've pretty much created and put on a map. No one was talking about living openly. People are like, what does that mean? It just means that you drop the secret. Doesn't mean that you wear a flag or a button or go around shouting out at the rooftops. It just means that you drop the secret and you decide what that looks like for you. Explain it to people the developmental process of what people should have as children. Because sometimes survivors, because we don't have words, all we have is a narrative of the violator inside our heads. And because we never speak it loudly, no one ever challenges it for us, right? Mm-hmm. And so sometimes as survivors started talking about and sharing their narratives, they would say things like, they would ask me questions like, well, what if I liked the abuse? And I would say, well, what did you like? And they'd say, well, there was attention and I had favors and I felt loved and special. I said, do you understand that all children are entitled to that? Right? Yeah. So you're not telling me that you actually created or forced this physical contact with someone. You're telling me that you wanted the love that all children are entitled to without having to sacrifice themselves as someone's object of physical expression. But you've never said those words. No one's ever invited you to say those words out loud. So no one's ever been able to help you craft the language around that experience. So those sorts of things are so important in terms of creating language for adult survivors. And so I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years crafting sort of what it means for survivors to have a voice. It's one thing to say you should have a voice. It's a whole nother thing to figure out what that voice
is.
Yeah, right.
And so what's been, because it seems to me, especially that in the last, I would say like maybe 3 to 5 years, there's been sort of an awakening around living openly when people have had severe trauma as children. What do you think was sort of the change and why it's now become I don't want to use the word acceptable, but like there is like the walls have started to come down in terms of like people acknowledging what's happened to them in the past?
I think the internet or social media has been huge in this movement, and I'm grateful for it because people do have a place to create a voice. There's some concerns about how people are creating voices because we haven't gotten to the part where it's healthy.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's a horrible analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's like trauma porn.
Yes, it absolutely is.
Yes. And it almost as if that's become the thing where it's like, well, my trauma is worse than your trauma. And you're like,
yep.
And it's like, no, it's right. Like this, like whatever you have gone through is your own personal story. And it shouldn't be like you're trying to one up someone.
Exactly.
And to be a part of to jump into this conversation, because oftentimes you're like, did that really happen? Or right. Are you just, because you want to be in this conversation, you're putting yourself in it.
Can I talk a little bit about Talking Trees, my organization?
You can go ahead.
So in 2010, I started the experience of the PTSD trigger was around 2007-ish. And so I spent the next couple of years trying to figure things out. In 2010 is when I created Talking Trees. And I created it for all of the reasons that we just talked about, to disseminate information, help create language, validate people's experience, that sort of stuff. I started on Facebook. I've been writing every day since 2010. And so I wanted to talk about what I think is special and what my vision is for adult survivors and what my vision is for people who want to advocate and help and support adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
Just one thing. So say that again, that you have been writing about how victims of trauma, the healing process, every day for 10 years.
Every day.
Published online somewhere.
Yes.
10 years.
10 years. Daily, no matter where I am in the world.
Do you stick to a certain number of words, or is it a line of poetry? What is it? So
in 2010, I think you were allowed about 80 words or 100 words. Remember?
Wow, that's early days.
Right.
That is early days.
Yeah. So it's changed a lot. There was a restriction on words when I started writing daily on Talking Trees. But remember, I said I did a lot of research and I wanted this to be. I've always written from a survivor perspective. So I've never gone on there and said, hey, I'm a psychologist who want to tell you how to live. No, I've always engaged as a survivor. But what I knew and understood was that the experience of adult survivors was so profound and our brains were so impacted by what it did not receive as children. So if I were going to write once a month or randomly, that wasn't going to help people. And so I knew that the commitment had to be to feed people daily, to get people to think about this and process daily. No one was living openly back then. And so I knew that my call to action had to be daily. So that was real important. I also knew that I was feeding myself that same information, because if I didn't, I was much more likely to call up my sister and say, oh, just kidding, come back, or something like that, go push myself back toward the dysfunction if you don't create something else to move forward to. So yeah, every day for the last 10 years, I write a post. Sometimes they're longer, sometimes they're shorter. But what survivors know is that there's someone out there thinking about them and their situation every single day. During the holiday time between Thanksgiving and Christmas, often write twice a day. I'm often, writing to the experience of this year you get to make different decisions about where you spend your holidays.
Absolutely right.
And just really trying to be in the lived experiences of survivors. Yeah, for 10 years I've been doing that.
And so, and with Talking Trees, how are you able to sort of connect with the survivors as well?
So so there's a couple of things that make it really special and effective. One is international. I stick with Facebook because at one point I tried to take it offline on Facebook and do the whole website thing. And then I realized, and 1/3 of our constituents are outside of the United States.
Oh, wow.
And we're up to about 7,000. And I don't have an interest in, let's get 20,000 members, because I write every day for a specific group of people who want to engage in the healing process. So one is international. Two, it is the only open site, at least it was when I created it in 2010, and maybe a couple of more. And so the whole point is about living openly. So if it's about living openly, we're not here to protect your secret. So my intention was to support survivors who are living openly, or help them along the journey of dropping their secret and living openly. So anybody can go on talkingtreesurvivors.com and get the link to the Facebook page. It's open. And people say, you can't have an open site. I say, yeah, I can. It grows slower, but not only do I write every day, I monitor it fiercely. And so there is not all the junk on there that you will see on many things. And they're original posts. I don't grab somebody else's words. I don't post memes. It's the original work of someone who comes here every day to walk a little bit with you in this journey until you find your own way, or until you no longer need that, or when you need it. So sometimes people come in, they drop in once a year. I haven't heard from that person in a year. Sometimes there are some people who have been reading daily since the beginning, but it is free flowing. The whole idea of Talking Trees is that you, as a survivor, design your own journey. I don't have steps for you to take. There are no 12 steps. There are no do this. There's no confront and it'll all be okay. Forgive and it'll all be okay. Every survivor gets to find their journey. I just want you to know that Talking Trees has your back. There's someone who's watching you in this journey, and I can hold your hand, give you some advice, but I can't tell you what the journey is. But I can assure you that every single day you will hear from me, so you will know that you're not walking this journey alone.
Fantastic. And what's been the response over the last 10 years?
So it's interesting. Last year was the first time I did actually try to do something with the numbers and ask myself, is this effective? Like, what are you doing? So I looked at our numbers from a year before the Me Too movement to a year after the Me Too movement. So and what I found was that within just that 24-month period, there had been over 2 million reactions, responses, hits to the Talking Trees post. And I thought, that's incredible for a site that's open, that's about living openly, and people don't come there to tell their stories. People come there to talk about the healing journey. It's not, as you say, the term that you used, a porn shop. Like, let me tell you what happened to me and how horrible my trauma is. And we don't do that on Talking Trees. We really engage in, what is this healing journey for you today? What do your relationships look like? What does your health status look like? Are you making mind-body connections? How are you treating yourself? Are you continuing to be small in the world? Those types of ideals. So we had over 2 million in 24 months, which means people are not only liking, but they're sharing. Keep in mind that the insights that I get from Facebook do not tell me what happens to the post if someone copies and pastes, which people do. Mm-hmm. That's just what they keep track of from Facebook and how it goes out in the world. So I'm excited about that. Not only that, the more fascinating part was that less than 1% attrition. Less than 1% of people got on Facebook and said, no, this isn't for me, I'm leaving. In that 24-month period that we looked at. 1% attrition. So not only are people coming, but they're staying because they're getting something that matters in their lives.
So you've really incredibly created a destination for survivors to have a home.
Yes.
It's phenomenal. So, question for you, what's next now? So you're 10 years in, writing every day, written a book, coming to the East Coast. Where do you see us going next? Obviously, the Me Too movement made a huge impact. because it forced a lot of people to sort of confront their own traumas and see it out in the forefront. But where do you see this going next?
I am hoping to develop a bigger platform. So one of the things that happened a couple of years ago when I released my own book, after 8 years, I finally decided to put my own narrative in words. And so when I did that, the purpose was to get out, to spread the movement out further. Because there, as other people are coming in to support survivors, and I hope that they do that well. I feel like it's time for me to move myself further out and create a bigger voice. And now what I've been doing is asking for listeners. So I've spent 10 years helping survivors sort of craft their voice. And now I'm going to people and going, who's listening? Are you listening? Doctors, are you listening when survivors come into your office? Psychologists, counselors, therapists, teachers, attorney, are you listening? Can you have kinder words? Can your ears perk up to notice or listen for, oh, this person may be a survivor. Maybe I should give them more information. Maybe I should ask more questions. So I'm now sort of spreading the message now that I'm saying people are talking, but it doesn't work until we get listeners. So I'm trying to bring listeners into the fold so that when survivors begin to speak, we don't begin to get questions like, well, why didn't you leave? Or what did you do? What would you know? Because that will not be helpful. So the healing journey works when there's a voice and a listener.
So it sounds like you need listeners with empathy.
Yes.
So you do the most incredible work, and I'm honored that you have been on my show. I have a question for you, though. What does Rosenna do for her own self-care? So is it you go for a run, you meditate, you do yoga, you watch trashy housewives on TV? What's the thing? Because I imagine it's still very heavy.
Yes.
What you do, and I know that your journey is not an easy one. So
Right.
how do you have some time for yourself?
I am the queen of self-care.
Fantastic.
I am the
Share it,
queen
girl.
of self-care. I love taking care of myself. I have to. And I will say this, keep in mind that, remember, I'm the person that thought perfection would keep me from trauma anyway.
Right.
So it wasn't a hard leap for me. But I just believe in the mind-body connection. It's so critical and so important. So I'm very connected to making sure that my body is okay. I do yoga. I do hot yoga. I do hot yoga at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Girl.
I will run at 5 o'clock in the morning because that's so important. I think especially when a body has been violated, there are so many unconscious ways that we can disconnect from the body, from what we eat to what we do, to the way that we engage in intimacy. And I am so cautious and careful not to fall prey to those enticements to just detach, right? And it can happen. Even if you've been taking care of yourself for 5 years, something happens, a trigger happened before you know you're no longer connected to your body. So I make it a habit of stay consciously connected to my body and really do my self-care. So yeah, the gym, the reading, all of that.
Okay, phenomenal. I was with you on the hot yoga because I love hot yoga. I would never do it at 6 o'clock in the morning because no, much less running at 5 in the morning. I'm not a morning person. But I think it's lovely to hear that you are the queen of self-care, because I think you also show that, yes, you can be in this sort of heavy world on a daily basis and providing support for others, but this is the most important. You have to put yourself first.
Thank you.
And so that's wonderful to hear. So Rosenna, it has been an absolute pleasure. Like I said, I was honored to have you on this show. I think your message will go to help so many people, because I think we've gotten to a point now where I think a lot more people are understanding it's okay to talk about this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's key. And I think, the fact that you've been doing this for 10 years every single day is phenomenal. So we'll put all the information about Talking Trees on our website and links to your book, so people can connect with you and just continue to share your message. But thank you so very much.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
And that's our show.